Welcome to our ecology lecture, everybody. This week we are actually covering a little bit of content that is drawn from the last three chapters of your textbook. Chapter 19, which is population and community ecology, Chapter 20, which is ecosystems in the biosphere, and Chapter 21, which is conservation and biodiversity. And we won't be exhaustively covering every single topic in these chapters, but instead picking out some of the most important concepts that cut across these three related areas and choosing to focus just on those. And these concepts are a great follow-up to the previous chapters that we just covered, exploring the wide variety of plants and animals and microorganisms that belong to the tree of life. We've looked at the characteristics of these different groups of organisms over the past few weeks, and now we're going to look at some of those organisms from the perspective of ecology, which is the subdiscipline of biology that studies the interactions between organisms and their environments. Ecology is a science that's interested in the workings of ecosystems, which are defined as a natural system consisting of a community of living organisms and non-living environmental elements. So while ecology is technically a specialized area of biology, it doesn't just exclusively concern itself with living things, but also the non-living environment, because living organisms depend upon the environment for their livelihood, and in turn, they can have a big impact on the environment as well. So ecology really looks at these systems and the way that the different elements of the system interact with each other. And these ecosystems can be very small or they can be very large. An ecosystem can be a single pond or it can be an entire rainforest. It can be a coral reef, it can be a cave, it can be the alpine tundra at the top of a mountain. All of these are examples of ecosystems that an ecologist might study. And some examples of the types of questions that they might study include: how does temperature and humidity influence the reproduction rate of mosquitoes? How does water pollution in the Gulf of Mexico affect the range of species present? How do gray wolves impact deer populations in the Rocky Mountains? So as you can see, all of these questions are looking at some aspect of an interaction between living things and their environment. The first question is asking how two characteristics of the environment, which are temperature and humidity, affect mosquito reproduction. The second question looks at how a consequence of human activity, namely water pollution, changes the species that live in the Gulf of Mexico. And then the third looks at how gray wolves, which are a natural predator of deer, impact deer populations. So in this case, wolves are considered part of the deer's environment. Yes, the wolves are also alive, but living things are part of the environment of other living things as well. So having seen those questions and now having a sense of what ecology is, I'd like in this first checkpoint for you to come up with at least two of your own original questions that an ecologist might study. Now, the examples of ecology questions that I showed you, you may have noticed that some of the questions focused on a single species and others incorporated multiple species. So as a reminder from our previous chapters, a species is defined as organisms that can breed together to produce viable, fertile offspring. A population is a group of individuals belonging to the same species that live and interact in a given area at a given time. So a herd of zebra living in a specific grassland area would be considered a population. It consists of a single species. When you're looking at multiple populations of different species, the term used to describe this is community. A community is defined as groups of different populations that live together and interact with each other in the same habitat. So that zebra population in the grassland would inevitably live within a community of other grassland organisms. So in this photo, we can see water buffalo and antelope alongside the zebra. But also when we talk about communities, we're not just talking about the animals, the plants are also considered part of the community. So all of the grasses and the shrubs that you see, as well as the microorganisms that live in the soil and in the water, these are all parts of the community. So we're going to look at these two scales of study, starting with population ecology. When ecologists study a population of organisms, there are multiple characteristics that they're interested in. The two biggest ones are typically population size and population density. Population size is self-explanatory. It's the total number of individuals. Population density describes the number of individuals per unit area or volume. So in other words, how closely packed a population is. And these two variables are especially important because they can affect many things: how long the population is able to persist, how well the individuals in the population can secure resources for themselves, how well they can secure mates, and many other outcomes as well. So size and density are very important to ecologists, but they also look at other characteristics of populations as well. One of these is the dispersion of the individuals within the population, which is the pattern in which the individuals are spaced out in the area that they occupy. So are they uniformly distributed like these penguins on the beach? Are they randomly distributed like the wildflowers in the field with no particular pattern? Or are they clumped like the herd of elephants on the right? Another characteristic of populations is their age structure, meaning the number of individuals belonging to different age groups within the population. So this variable is mostly pertinent to animals, although it can be relevant to some plant species as well. So for example, within a population of elephants, you might look at how many are babies versus adolescents versus adults versus seniors. On the left here, you can see what's called an age structure diagram, which displays the number of individuals of the youngest ages in the bars toward the bottom. And then as you go up, it gets into the older ages. So if the diagram is pyramid shaped, as is roughly the case for this one, then there are more younger organisms than older organisms in the population. If you see an inverse pyramid, then it would be the opposite. There's more older ones than younger ones. And this can be indicative of how much reproduction is taking place and whether the population is growing or shrinking. You can also see that the diagram shows you another characteristic of the population, which is defined on the slide, which is sex ratio. And that's the proportion of males to females in the population. And again, this is largely relevant to animals rather than plants. So in this diagram of the elephant population under study, the males are represented in the green on the left, and then the females are represented in the gray on the right. And the sex ratio information is also relevant to the stability of the population because, in general, female organisms are the ones that typically bear most of the physical burden of reproduction. So if a population is very deficient in females versus males, then this can spell trouble for the long-term survival of the population. So we'll now take a pause for a couple of checkpoint questions. In this first one, we will consider the example of a creosote bush, which you may know is also called by other names. You may know it as greasewood, gobernadora, or edionia. Whatever you know it by, creosote secretes a chemical that kills other plants around it within a certain radius, including other creosote bushes, which benefits the plant by reducing its competition for water and other resources. So this results in what type of pattern of distribution, which you can see in the photo on the right. And in this checkpoint question, I'd like you to use your imagination and think of an example of a set of conditions where it would be beneficial for a plant or animal to exhibit a clumped distribution pattern, and describe that set of conditions. So we've now looked at some of the characteristics that ecologists are interested in when they're studying populations. Another important idea when studying populations is the concept of carrying capacity, which is the maximum population size that an environment can support. Because any environment can only support a finite, limited number of organisms that depend upon it for their needs. And that limit, or that carrying capacity, is defined by two different types of factors. Density-dependent factors are ones that depend on the density of the population. Density-independent factors are ones that are not influenced by a population's density. So density-dependent factors are usually biological in nature. They include things like predation, meaning the presence of predators, as well as competition for food, competition for mates, accumulation of waste in the environment, and the presence of communicable diseases. And when it comes to density-dependent factors, a higher density usually corresponds to a population experiencing a higher death rate and a lower birth rate. For example, if a population is more dense, then there's less food per individual, which can lead to deaths from starvation and also make conditions not good for breeding and reproduction. Also, if a population is more dense, diseases can spread more readily between members of the population because they can jump from individual to individual more easily, which also increases death rate and lowers birth rate. One concrete example of density-dependent factors in action can be seen here in this graph. So this graph is the result of studies on a parasitic roundworm called Ascaris lumbricoides, which we mentioned before. It infects the gastrointestinal tract of humans and animals. There's an estimated 1 billion people worldwide that are infected by this guy. So on this graph, you can see the number of worms on the horizontal x-axis and the number of eggs per female on the vertical y-axis. And you can see that as the number of worms goes up, in other words, as you go right on the graph, the female worms lay fewer and fewer eggs. And this is because when resources are more scarce due to there being a more dense population, the female worms don't grow as large, and with a smaller body size, they aren't capable of laying as many eggs. So that's one example of a density-dependent factor that limits population growth. There's also density-independent factors, and these things are usually physical in nature. They include things like weather extremes, natural disasters, pollution, things that kill organisms, but the density of the organisms doesn't matter. For example, a flood is a natural disaster that might kill an entire colony of rabbits. It doesn't matter if there are 10 rabbits in each burrow or 50 rabbits in each burrow. The flood is going to come through and do its damage regardless of the population density. Another example is shown in this graph. This one shows the number of aphids, which are a type of insect that feeds on the sap of many different crop plants. If you're a gardener, you've probably seen them before. In this little photo, they are the tiny orange bugs on the bottom of the leaf. So this graph is showing the size of an aphid population over the course of the year. And you can see that the population peaks during the summer, and then it steeply drops off. And that's because aphids are highly sensitive to the cold. So when the nighttime temperatures start dropping, the aphids start dying. It doesn't matter how dense their population is, the cold is going to kill them regardless. This brings us to another checkpoint, which looks at the sad history of the Gros Michel banana. So the Gros Michel banana was the main subspecies of banana grown commercially in the first half of the 20th century. And it was the only banana available for purchase in the US during this time. And if you've ever had banana-flavored candies, like Laffy Taffies or Runts, and you thought to yourself, wow, that doesn't taste like banana at all, that's because the banana flavor that we still have today in candy was developed based on the flavor profile of the Gros Michel banana before the Gros Michel banana went away. So during the 1950s, an infectious fungus known as Panama disease quickly spread through Gros Michel banana crops, and it devastated over 100,000 acres of cropland. This old photo on the left is of a banana tree in Costa Rica that was infected with Panama disease. And the disease was so devastating to banana plantations that the Gros Michel subspecies had to be completely abandoned and replaced with the Cavendish banana, which is naturally resistant to Panama disease, and the Cavendish banana is what you'll find in grocery stores today. So does this situation describe a density-dependent or density-independent factor? So we've taken a look at some of the things that population ecologists are interested in. And remember, a population consists of just a single species. But there are also community ecologists who, instead of focusing on just a single species, look at the dynamics between different species interacting within a community. So now we're going to take a look at some of the concepts that community ecologists are interested in. One of these is symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic relationships are close relationships between two separate species. And there are three major categories of symbiotic relationships. Mutualism is a type of symbiotic relationship where two species both benefit from their interaction. So, for example, oxpeckers are a type of bird that sits on wildebeests and eats the ticks that have attached themselves to the wildebeest's body. So the bird benefits by getting a food source, and the wildebeest benefits by having the ticks removed from their body. The second form of symbiotic relationship is commensalism. This is a relationship where one species benefits while the other one is unaffected. For instance, those oxpecker birds, they construct their nests in trees, and this has no impact on the tree itself, but it provides significant benefit to the bird. And then lastly, there's parasitism, which is where one species benefits while the other one is harmed. So parasitism is a form of predation, where the organism that's serving as the host for the parasite is not immediately killed, it's just weakened. So an example of this interaction relates to the example that we gave for mutualism. The tick that is biting the wildebeest is a parasite that benefits from feeding on the wildebeest's blood, while the wildebeest is harmed by this association. So these are the three types of relationships that occur between organisms and communities. But there are also organisms that play specific roles in the broader dynamics of the community, which ecologists are often interested in studying. One of these is the foundation species. Foundation species are considered the foundation of a community in that they have the greatest influence on the dynamics of the community. Often, the foundation species is a producer, such as plants or algae or plankton. So these organisms, because they are producers, they are the entry point for energy to come into the ecosystem. They're at the bottom of the food chain. They perform photosynthesis and convert sunlight energy into usable chemical energy. And so everything else depends upon them. They're abundant, they're important, and therefore the loss of those species can have a chain effect that radiates throughout the community. So for instance, coral is considered the foundation species of coral reef ecosystems. And when that coral is killed, it makes it virtually impossible for the ecosystem to support the range of other organisms that are dependent on it, whether that's directly dependent or indirectly dependent. Another type of species that plays a significant role in communities is a keystone species. A keystone species is a species that has an outsized influence on maintaining the structure of the community, meaning that its level of influence is disproportionately large compared to how many of these organisms there are. So there may not be many of them, but the depletion or loss of these species leads to a significant disruption in the community. And this term keystone species actually comes from the field of architecture, where the keystone is the center stone that is responsible for bearing a significant amount of the mass and force within the structure of a bridge. So it's a relatively small part of the bridge, but it plays a big role in keeping the whole thing together. An example of a keystone species is the intertidal sea star, which is part of shoreline ecosystems. So when these sea stars are lost from their community, what happens is they stop eating mussels, which are a type of shellfish that you can see in this photo. They're attached to the rocks surrounding the sea stars. And without their natural predator, the mussel populations shoot up and the mussels come to dominate the community. They'll cover all of the available surfaces, so they outcompete other organisms for space and resources, and they really just take over and make it difficult for other organisms to survive in the ecosystem, all because the sea stars were lost. The last type of species that we'll talk about that community ecologists are interested in is the invasive species. An invasive species is a non-native organism that gets introduced to new areas, often by human activity, and then comes to alter the structure of the community in that area. One example of an invasive species that you may have noticed very prominently in recent years in southern Arizona is a plant called stinknet, also known as globe chamomile. So this plant is native to South Africa, and it was first documented in Arizona in 2005. Since then, it has spread extensively throughout both Pinal County and Maricopa County. And stinknet overtakes desert habitats, as you can see in the upper photo here, and it competes with the native desert plants for water and for space, which of course reduces the survival ability of those native plants. It also reduces the quality of rangeland used for raising cattle because livestock don't like to eat stinknet. The stinknet will choke out other plants that the livestock would eat, but the livestock won't eat the stinknet itself. And that leaves less foliage for the livestock to subsist on. And then finally, having these blankets of stinknet across the desert increases the risk and severity of wildfires because when temperatures start to get hot in the summer, the stinknet dies and it leaves behind this crispy bed of dried plant matter, and it's really just a tinderbox for the rapid spread of wildfires. So this is one example of an invasive species in our area and the many negative impacts that it has on the community and the ecosystem. And of course, these invasive species and their effects, they're something that community ecologists study to try to understand how do they affect the composition of the community and the native species and the overall health of the ecosystem. In just a moment, we're going to look at a different type of disturbance, which is natural disasters, and how they can affect the composition of a community. But before we do, I have a couple checkpoints for you. Cattle egrets feed on insects that are brought up when grazing mammals disturb the soil in the process of eating grasses. Which of the three types of symbiotic relationships is embodied in this example? And then for checkpoint 6, we have 3 examples described in the blue boxes at the bottom, one on European rabbits, one on beavers, and one on giant kelp. So the objective here is to match the type of species in the blue box to one of the 3 green boxes above, where we have foundation species, invasive species, and keystone species. Now, as we said, the introduction of an invasive species can cause a change in the dynamics of a community. But communities can also be disturbed and transformed by natural events, which can include volcanoes, earthquakes, storms, fires, floods. And after an event like this occurs, what follows is a process called ecological succession. Ecological succession is the sequential appearance and disappearance of species in a community over time after a severe disturbance. So what this means is that after a landscape has been devastated by a natural disaster, there is a well-documented series of events that occurs as biological life returns to the landscape, where certain species come on the scene first, and they pave the way for others to join, until over the course of many, many years, this thriving community gets reestablished. And there are 2 types of ecological succession that are distinguished based on just how deep the devastation to the environment is. And those are primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession is the term used to describe scenarios where an area has been made virtually lifeless with no soil, or when new land is formed through a volcanic eruption or lava flow. So the key point of primary succession is that the ecosystem is truly starting from scratch. It's just bare rock, and that's why it's called primary succession, because primary means first or the beginning, and in primary succession, the ecosystem is going back to the beginning and starting over. So this image is meant to show a sort of time lapse of what happens during the different stages of primary succession as a barren landscape is being recolonized by living organisms. So the earliest stages are shown on the left, and then the later stages are shown on the right. And although this is all being summarized in one picture, the process takes hundreds of years to transform from what you see on the left to what you see on the right. So initially, the rock that represents the blank slate is weathered and broken down slowly over time, which allows certain tough, adaptable species to move in and establish themselves. This generally starts with lichens, which, if you've ever gone hiking in Arizona, you may have seen before. Lichen is a combination of fungus and algae. They're very good at growing on surfaces, including rocks, which is what you see in this photo. The lichen will contribute to the further weathering of the rocks, and eventually it'll be possible for some small annual plants to move in. When we say that these plants are annual, what this means is that they are seasonal. They don't exist there year-round, but they rather spring up and then die back with the seasons. And as time goes on, grasses and perennial plants move in. Perennials are ones that can survive year after year. They're the opposite of annuals. And these initial species that colonize the landscape are known as pioneer species. They are the first ones to arrive on the scene when things are still looking pretty rough, but they pave the way for other, less hardy species to move in, because through their root systems and their metabolism, they will contribute to the development of a true soil, rather than just the barren rock. And those soils can then support plant species like shrubs and trees, and eventually those shrubs and trees can create circumstances where the environment is no longer hospitable for the pioneer species. So for example, the trees can create so much shade that some small plant species can no longer survive. And eventually the succession process leads to the community reaching its final form, which is known as the climax community. And this is the state of the community where it's in a stable state. It's no longer in the process of transformation. So that's how primary succession works. Secondary succession looks somewhat similar, but the starting point is different. Secondary succession happens when much of the community is destroyed by a natural disaster, but at the very least, part of the community remains alive in the soil. So we're talking bacteria, fungus, worms, insects. These are things that can survive many natural disasters like floods or fires or earthquakes. And while it may not seem like keeping this part of the community intact makes a huge difference, it really does. Because in secondary succession, the ecosystem doesn't have to start completely from scratch. So instead of barren rock, there's some life already there to facilitate the bouncing back of the ecosystem. So because of this, secondary succession happens much more quickly than primary succession. It can still take 150 plus years, but primary succession can take many hundreds of years. And as far as stages go, secondary succession looks a lot like primary succession. Let's say a wildfire rolls through and roasts the landscape. The first organisms on the scene will be small annual plants, followed by grasses, then perennial plants, and these are the pioneer species, and then the shrubs and trees emerge, and then eventually the climax community is achieved, just like with primary succession. This brings us to a checkpoint on the topic of ecological succession. So in 1980, an earthquake triggered the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington state. The earthquake started with a huge landslide on the north side of the mountain, which destabilized the volcano and caused what's called a lateral blast, which is a sideways explosion of the entire north face of the mountain. And these photos from the U.S. Geological Survey show the lateral blast as it was occurring. And between the landslide and the blast and then the resulting volcanic mudslides, hundreds of square miles were reduced to lifeless, barren rock and ash on the side of the mountain. And then since the eruption, this area has slowly been returning to life, with the biological community redeveloping, as you can see in the more recent photo on the right-hand side. So the question in this checkpoint is, which type of succession is embodied in the example of Mount St. Helens? So we've just spent some time discussing ways that communities can be disrupted. And now we're going to change gears and look at another way that communities across the planet are changing, which is through the loss of biodiversity. What is biodiversity? You probably already know what diversity is. It's essentially variety. And so biodiversity is the variety that we see in living things. That's actually the definition that your textbook gives. It's a broad term for biological variety. But what does this really mean? We're going to look at a couple other definitions to get a better picture than what's embodied in that textbook definition. The World Wildlife Fund defines biodiversity as the millions of plants, animals, and microorganisms, the genes they contain, and the intricate ecosystems they help build into the living environment. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity defines it as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes diversity within a species, between species, and of ecosystems. If you compare these two definitions, you can see that even though they are worded differently, they actually both state that biodiversity has three different pieces to it, which I've sort of roughly color coded within those definitions. There's the range of different species that exist, there's the genetic variation within a species, and then there are the ecosystems that the species are a part of. So biodiversity is not just a matter of how many different organisms are out there, although this is part of how biodiversity is measured. This component of biodiversity is called species diversity. And for a long time, this was the traditional way of measuring how diverse an ecosystem was. Species diversity is measured based on the number of species in an ecosystem, which is known as species richness, as well as how many individuals are part of the species population, which is known as relative abundance. So let's briefly take a closer look at the difference between species richness and relative abundance. Species richness is the number of species living in a particular ecosystem. So if we look at the two communities shown in the illustrations on the right, community 1 on the top has a species richness of 4, meaning there are 4 different species of trees in this community, labeled A, B, C, D. If we look below to community 2, this community also has a species richness of 4. So if you look closely, you'll see that this community has the same 4 species of trees present, A, B, C, and D. However, unlike community 1, community 2 is dominated by tree A, with very few instances of trees B, C, and D. And this is where relative abundance comes in. Relative abundance is the number of individuals of a particular species relative to the total number of individuals in all species within a particular area. So it refers to not just the number of different species, but their proportion compared to the others. So this means that if we're talking in terms of species richness, community 1 and 2 are equally diverse, but if we're talking in terms of relative abundance, community 1 is more diverse than community 2 because within community 2, the relative abundance of one particular type of tree is so high and the relative abundance of the other trees is very low. So that's how species diversity is measured. But as we now know, species diversity is just one of the components of biodiversity. Also wrapped up in biodiversity is genetic diversity. Using genetic information to measure the diversity across living organisms is a more recent approach because it's only been in recent decades that the technology has even existed to perform the types of studies that look at genetic information of living organisms. But it has become an important measure of how much variation exists within a population, meaning within the same species. Because remember, a population refers to a group of organisms all belonging to the same species. An example of genetic biodiversity in the real world is seen in the case of elephant seals, which we mentioned before when we were learning about evolution. There are 2 distinct subspecies of elephant seals in the world. There's the northern elephant seals, which live in the northern hemisphere, and the southern elephant seals that live in the southern hemisphere. The northern elephant seals are shown on the left. You can see the map below it has its habitat range, which includes the Pacific coast of North America. And then southern elephant seals are on the right. and you can see that they live around the Antarctic continent. And before the 1800s, there were hundreds of thousands of northern elephant seals living on the Pacific coast of North America. But then, due to them being extensively hunted by humans for their blubber, their population was brought down to less than 100 individuals. And eventually, both Mexico and the US made it illegal to hunt them. And now the population has rebounded to nearly 200,000. But all of those 200,000 come from that very small group of 100. So even though there's a lot of them, they lack genetic diversity compared to the southern elephant seals. The southern elephant seals never went through a bottleneck effect. And studies show that the southern elephant seals are much more genetically diverse today than the northern elephant seals are. They have a wider range of characteristics and traits, etc. So bottom line is that biodiversity is not only measured in terms of how many different types of species are out there, but looking within a species, how diverse is the range of individuals on a genetic level. The third component of biodiversity is called ecosystem diversity. This is also a more recent approach to measuring biodiversity. Ecosystem diversity refers to the number of different ecosystems on Earth or in a particular region. So remember, an ecosystem is a natural system consisting of a community of living organisms and non-living environmental elements. So some examples of ecosystems you may have heard of before are the desert, coral reef, tropical rainforests, tide pools, etc. All of these are systems of living and non-living elements existing in the same space and undergoing unique interactions. And those interactions can be very important and beneficial. So one example of an ecosystem that is almost entirely extinct in the US is tallgrass prairie. Tallgrass prairie used to cover 170 million acres of the North American continent, which is the equivalent of 230,000 square miles. And this area is represented on the part of the map that's colored green on the right-hand side. And today, the National Park Service estimates that less than 4% of the original tallgrass prairie ecosystem remains intact. Historically, the prairie was a flourishing and highly productive ecosystem where large grazing mammals, especially bison, would graze and enrich the soil with their droppings, and then the decomposition of these dense grasses also contributed nutrients to the soil. The result was an incredibly rich topsoil that farmers benefited from for many years. But now agriculture has moved in and it has destroyed almost all of the tallgrass prairie, and the process tilled away a lot of that rich topsoil. One study estimates that almost 58 billion tons of fertile topsoil have been eroded by agriculture in the Midwest. And that topsoil is never coming back because the ecosystem that created it, the tallgrass prairie, is gone. It's been replaced by human development and farmland. So the benefit that was created by that ecosystem is being used up and it won't come back. Now, to recap our understanding of the three components of biodiversity, in this checkpoint, I'd like you to tell me which of the three components of biodiversity is being threatened in each case. So these are three statements of fact. Number one, in the past 50 years, over 50% of coral reefs have been destroyed. Number two, as of 2016, 35 species of amphibians have gone extinct. Number three, there are less than 100 Sumatran rhinos left on Earth, down from 800 in 1986. So which of the three components of biodiversity is affected in each of these? So as you may have gathered from that checkpoint, biodiversity is under threat across the world. And we're going to talk more about that in just a few moments. Before we do, though, let's look at how biodiversity is distributed across the planet. One of the major trends in biodiversity is that you won't find equal levels of biodiversity in all geographic regions across the globe. Biodiversity is highest at the equator, and it decreases as you move closer to each of the poles. So this map of the Western Hemisphere shows mammal species richness, which, remember, is the number of species present in both North and South America. So darker colors correspond to more species, and as you can see, the highest concentration of species is around where the equator would cross through the top part of South America. And you get a lower and lower concentration of species as you move towards the polar regions. Another example of where you can see this manifested is in a comparison between two aquatic ecosystems in different parts of the world. So let's look at Lake Victoria, which is a lake in eastern Central Africa, and Lake Huron, which is one of the Great Lakes in North America. Both are very large lakes. As you can see, both can be seen quite clearly in satellite imagery from space. Lake Victoria is 26,000 square miles in area, and Lake Huron is 23,000 square miles in area. So they're pretty similar in size, but they're very different in biodiversity. So historically, Lake Victoria contained over 500 species of cichlids, which is just one single family of fish, and they were native to the lake. And as we mentioned in our lecture in evolution, in the 1950s, there was another predatory fish called the Nile perch introduced to the lake by British colonizers so that they could fish it as a good food source. And that led to a mass extinction of the cichlids. But prior to that, the lake was extremely biodiverse, and it contained many unique species that weren't found anywhere else in the world. In contrast, Lake Huron contains only 79 total species of fish, none of which are unique to the lake. They're found in many other lakes in North America. So we have two relatively similarly sized lakes, but very different levels of biodiversity. So what accounts for the difference? One major difference is the geography relative to the equator. Lake Victoria is literally intersected by the equator, so it's located in a tropical zone, whereas Lake Huron is located at some major distance from the equator in a cold forested biome. And these lakes embody just one example of this general trend where the tropics are more biodiverse and the temperate regions are less biodiverse, especially as you get further north and south. Scientists have several hypotheses as to why this is the case. One of them has to do with the fact that tropical ecosystems are older than temperate ecosystems, meaning they've existed in their current state for longer. And that is because 20,000 years ago, the temperate zones of North America were covered in sheet ice, which means there were no ecosystems there at all. There was just ice. So the tropics have had a longer time for development, which means they've had a longer period of time and more opportunities for speciation, which, remember, is the process of new species forming. Another hypothesis has to do with the fact that tropical ecosystems get more sunlight than temperate ecosystems. So regions around the equator simply get more direct light than the far north and south. And it's not entirely understood how this translates into a larger number of species, but it may be the case that with more sunlight, more photosynthesizing organisms like plants and algae can be supported, and that creates more complexity in ecosystems with more habitats that organisms can evolve and adapt to. And then finally, the third hypothesis has to do with the fact that tropical ecosystems have more stable climate conditions than temperate ecosystems, because regions in the tropic have less variation in their low and high temperatures, and they also have less variation in the temperatures between the seasons. So their summer and winter temperatures are more close together. And the length of day versus night doesn't change as dramatically throughout the year. So it may be the case that those conditions create the kind of stability needed for robust biodiversity. One other feature of biodiversity in the tropics is that they have higher numbers of endemic species. Endemic species are species that are native to and only found in one location. The area to which they are endemic can be very large or it can be very small. So for instance, blue jays are endemic to North America. You can find them pretty much anywhere east of the Rockies, which is a huge habitat range, but you just won't find them on other continents. They're only endemic to this continent. On the other hand, the Quito desert pupfish is endemic to just a few springs and ponds in the Organ Pipe National Monument in southern Arizona, which totals an area of about 4 square miles. So, not surprisingly, the Quito pupfish is considered endangered because it has such a restricted habitat, so it is highly vulnerable to extinction. you can imagine a situation where a single earthquake or one season of severe drought could destroy its entire habitat and cause extinction. And this transitions us nicely into our final topic, which is biodiversity loss and its consequences. The Earth is experiencing biodiversity loss, which is the term used to describe the decline in biodiversity resulting from the displacement or extinction of species. And to be clear, some level of biodiversity loss happens all the time. It is inevitable. The background extinction rate is the term that's used to describe the natural rate at which species go extinct without the influence of human activity. We know what a normal background extinction rate is by looking at the fossil records, which can tell us how many species disappear over a particular period of time. And it turns out that rate is about 1 to 5 species per million species on Earth every year. However, the current extinction rate is about 100 times faster than the background rate. And this means that during the lifespan of the average person in the US, 23,000 species will go extinct. This is a very big number, and it is definitely reason for concern. Organizations dedicated to species conservation across the world keep track of species that are at risk for extinction so that intervention can be hopefully made before it's too late. And there's a classification system used by an organization called the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN, which categorizes each species based on how urgent the level of concern is for its continued existence. On one end of the IUCN classification spectrum is organisms that are already extinct. So this means organisms that no longer exist anywhere in the world. They're not in the wild, they're not in captivity, they are not anywhere. A well-known example of an extinct species is the Tasmanian tiger, which was native to Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea. It went extinct in 1936 when the last known member of its species died at a zoo in Australia. One small step down from that category is extinct in the wild. These are species that no longer exist in their natural habitats, but they still exist in captivity or through human intervention. So one example of an animal in this category is Spix's macaw, which is a parrot that was native to Brazil and has been extinct in the wild since 2019, although there are some birds that are still cared for by conservation organizations or zoos, and efforts are being made to try to reintroduce them to the wild. Then there's the category critically endangered. These are species that are facing extremely high risks of extinction in the wild. So their populations are declining rapidly, and urgent measures are needed to prevent total extinction. The Albany cycad, which is a plant that is endemic to the Eastern Cape region of South Africa, is in this category. The Albany cycad has only 70 individual plants left as of July 2023, according to IUCN. This might look like it's your run-of-the-mill palm tree in the photo, but it is not. It is not a palm tree at all. It's actually more closely related to a pine tree. It's a gymnosperm. It produces its seeds in cones. And these cycads are a very ancient organism. Their fossils go back through many geological periods. But today, many species, including this one, are almost extinct. The next category is endangered. This includes species that are facing a very high risk of extinction in the near future. They have declining populations and they are at a significant risk of disappearing if the threats are not addressed. So an example of a species that is categorized as endangered is the Iberian lynx, which is endemic to Portugal and Spain. The Iberian lynx lost about 80% of its habitat range between 1960 and 2000, and as of July 2023, there are an estimated 156 Iberian lynx left in the wild. The next category label is vulnerable. These are species that are facing a high risk of extinction in the medium-term future. Their numbers aren't as low as endangered or critically endangered, but they are still at risk and require conservation. Snow leopards, which are native to the Himalayas, are classified as vulnerable. There's somewhere around 3,000 snow leopards left on Earth. Near threatened is the next category. This includes species that are close to qualifying for a threatened category, but they are not yet considered threatened. However, their populations may be in decline and they may be facing threats in the future. So an example of organism in this category is the serpentine sunflower, which is endemic to California and Oregon, and it has an estimated range of only 160 square kilometers, which are mostly in mountainous areas that are vulnerable to climate change. Conservation-dependent species are ones that are considered low risk, but they are dependent on conservation efforts to prevent them from becoming threatened. One example of an organism in this category is the black caiman, which is a crocodile endemic to South America, which is now considered to be at low risk, but they were classified as endangered in the 1970s because humans were overhunting them to make crocodile leather. But since then, the species rebounded once the overhunting declined. And then lastly, there's this category, least concern. This includes species with very low risk that are not likely to be threatened in the future. Pigeons are an example of a creature in this category, probably to no one's surprise. If you spent any time in a major city in America in recent years, you can probably see that pigeons are doing just fine for themselves. So those are the categories and some examples of organisms in each category. But to give you a more comprehensive picture of the state of affairs in biodiversity loss, this figure shows you different categories of organisms and what proportion of them are classified into each of the IUCN categories. I won't go into too much detail elaborating on this, but just to orient you, at the top you can see a color code with abbreviations. So EW means extinct in the wild, CR means critically endangered, EN means endangered. The larger proportion of red that you see for a category, the worse off this group of organisms is. And they've roughly been organized where the best off is at the top and the worst off is at the bottom. So you can see that cycads at the very bottom are really on the margins. Amphibians aren't doing well either. I encourage you to pause the video and just take a quick closer look at the figure to get a sense of what the conservation status looks like for these different groups, because for lots of them, things do not look good. Which raises another set of questions that will be the focus of the very last part of this lecture, which is, why is all this biodiversity loss happening, and why should you care? For the first question, unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that human activity is the major cause of decreasing biodiversity. Nature is sort of fighting this multi-front battle against human activity. And one of those fronts is habitat loss. Large amounts of habitats have been destroyed through urban development, agriculture, and the accompanying deforestation, which is the term used to describe destruction of forests. The Earth has lost a third of its forests since humans began to develop agriculture 12,000 years ago, and that amounts to an area 2 times greater than the landmass of the United States. A full 1,000,000 hectares were lost from the planet each year between 1980 and 1990. The time lapse that you see on the screen shows the deforestation of Madagascar as seen through satellite imagery between 1984 and 2016. And you can clearly see how much the landscape has been transformed by the loss of vegetation. And you can imagine how animal life would then also be affected by that loss. Habitat loss is also brought about by the damming of rivers and streams. So in these photos, you can see the Hetch Hetchy Valley, which was once a flowing stream and wetland, as you can see on the left photo. But in 1923, the area was dammed and turned into a reservoir in order to generate hydroelectric power for the city of San Francisco. So the wetland in the valley was flooded, which completely destroyed the native habitat and transformed it into something totally different. And then finally, habitats are also being destroyed through pollution. This applies to both habitats on land and habitats in the water. For instance, the Mississippi River drains into the Gulf of Mexico, and it carries with it so much pollution runoff from agriculture that it has created what's known as a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that is largely devoid of life. And the total area of this dead zone is larger than the state of Delaware. The affected area is shown in the illustration here. The shoreline above it belongs mostly to Louisiana, but also partly Texas as well. Biodiversity loss is also being caused by overharvesting. Overharvesting essentially means taking more from nature than it can replenish. And one way this can happen is through overhunting. There are many examples of species that have been driven to extinction due to being overhunted. Two examples you see here are the Caribbean monk seal on the bottom, which was hunted to extinction in the early 50s, and the passenger pigeon on the top, which was previously native to North America. It served as a significant food source for people until it was hunted to extinction in the early 1900s. The photo that you see here of this particular bird was taken in the very late 1800s. The last passenger pigeon died in captivity in 1914. There are many other instances of animals that have been hunted nearly to extinction, but then ended up being saved because humans managed to overlook some small population that was unknown to them, like the northern elephant seals that we talked about previously. Poaching is also a threat to many species. Poaching is essentially illegal hunting, and some examples of species that are being threatened by poaching are elephants for their ivory, rhinos for their horn, and Asiatic black bears for the bile in its gallbladder. Ivory is a luxury good, and bear bile and rhino horn are both used in traditional medicine, although I should add that there is no evidence whatsoever that powdered rhino horn has any medical benefit at all. It is made of the same thing that your fingernails are made of. So eating rhino horn is basically like eating ground up fingernails. And thinking that there's any medical benefit to that is pretty absurd, and it makes the endangerment of rhinos for this purpose even more senseless. But I digress on that point. Maybe the biggest threat from overharvesting is to marine fisheries. A marine fishery is a habitat in the ocean where fish live and are commercially harvested. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that 90% of marine fisheries worldwide are being fished at their maximum capacity or overfished, meaning that more fish are being taken out than can be replenished. So the populations are in decline. And when the population of a fish becomes low enough, it can lead to marine fishery collapse, which is when the population of the fish becomes so small that there's no longer a harvestable number of fish within the habitat. One well-documented example of marine fishery collapse is the case of cod off the Atlantic coast of Canada. This graph shows how much cod was being caught in the region for hundreds of years. And as you can see, it started increasing around 1700, but in the mid-1900s, there was a sharp uptick when this new factory-style equipment was introduced to pull large numbers of fish from the ocean. And then it didn't take long before the fishery collapsed. The population declined dramatically. The fishing operations had no choice but to close, and the cod population in this region still has not recovered to this day. Another way that humans are fueling biodiversity loss is by introducing invasive species to new habitats. And remember from earlier in the lecture, an invasive species is a non-native organism that is introduced to a new area and then has a significant impact on the community. Humans travel around the globe unlike any other species ever has. And we also move species around with us when we travel, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. Some examples of accidental introduction of invasive species include the introduction of the brown tree snake, which was accidentally transported to the island of Guam by US military aircraft after World War II. And since then, the brown tree snake has led to the extinction of 3 species of birds and at least 3 other reptiles that were endemic to Guam. Another example is the zebra mussel, which was accidentally transported from Europe to the Great Lakes via ship. And zebra mussels have not only outcompeted native species of shellfish in the Great Lakes, but they've also led to huge costs dedicated to cleaning up pipes and waterways because they'll colonize them and block them, as you can see in the upper right-hand photo. Then there's intentional introduction of invasive species. This also happens. Some examples we've already mentioned in this lecture are the introduction of the Nile perch, which is shown in this photo, into Lake Victoria in Africa, which led to the devastation of the native cichlid fish. European rabbits were also brought to Australia, and they dramatically altered the landscape through their consumption of the plants there. And in both of these cases, the species was introduced with the intention that humans would be able to hunt and fish for them, but the move seriously backfired. And then a final type of invasive species that sometimes gets overlooked is infectious microorganisms. So bacteria and fungus are living organisms too, and therefore they are technically invasive species when they're transplanted from one area to another. An example is white nose syndrome in bats, which is caused by an infectious fungus that was introduced to North America from Europe, and it has led to steep declines in bat populations. There have been several bat species that are now on the verge of extinction as a result. And this graph here shows data collected by the US National Park Service in Acadia National Park off the coast of Maine. And it shows how white nose syndrome arrived in the park in 2011, 2012, and then bat populations dropped by 86% after that. And they have remained at these dangerously low levels. And another example of an invasive infectious microorganism that we mentioned previously is Panama disease, which is the fungus that wiped out the Gromy shell banana, originated in Southeast Asia, but human activity transported it all over different parts of the globe where bananas are grown, which basically sealed the fate of the Gromy shell banana. The final way that humans are driving biodiversity loss is through climate change. Emission of greenhouse gases is causing global temperatures to rise and precipitation levels to change in many parts of the Earth. Summer 2023 was the hottest and driest ever recorded in southern Arizona. There were 31 straight days of high temperatures that were over 110 degrees, and there was only 0.15 inches of rain recorded in Phoenix. And as a consequence, even species that are native to the Sonoran Desert suffered. So fallen saguaro cactuses were a commonplace sight that summer. And native Sonoran Desert species like saguaros, as you probably know, they're already pretty well adapted to this habitat, but the ever increasing temperatures and drought are pushing them to these brinks where even though they're well adapted, they are having trouble surviving. Climate change is also resulting in sea level rise. And this is because rising temperatures are causing glaciers and ice shelves to melt around the globe. So here are some photos of examples of glaciers that have been melting as our climate changes. On the left, you can see two images of the Peterson Glacier in Alaska's Kenai Mountains. The left photo was taken in 1917, and the right photo was taken in 2005. And the two photos are almost unrecognizable as being the same space, but you can see the mountains in the background of each photo, and that marks them as, yes, they are indeed the same place. The difference is that a huge volume of the glacier has melted and receded. And on the right, there is a photo of the Muir Glacier, also in Alaska, in August 1941 on the top, and then August 2004 on the bottom. And again, almost unrecognizable as the same space, but the surrounding mountains show us that this is the same area, but the ice has turned into liquid in the bottom photo, and you can see that the remaining glacier is still there in the far distance. And as all of this ice is melting, the liquid water has to go somewhere, and it ends up draining into the ocean, which is causing sea levels to rise. So specifically, sea levels have risen 8 inches, which is the equivalent of 20 centimeters since the year 1880, and they're projected to rise a whole lot more. And this puts coastal environments and island nations at risk. One case study of this is the island of New Moor, which was an island in the Indian Ocean located between Bangladesh and India. And the territory was disputed by both of those countries. Both of them laid claim to it. But the dispute was settled by climate change in 2010 when the ocean swallowed it up and the island no longer exists. It's all underwater. So naturally, if land is being swallowed by the ocean, the species that reside in those shoreline habitats are under threat. The final way that biodiversity is threatened by climate change is through the change in habitat ranges of insects that carry diseases. So there's a lot of insects that carry diseases that are transmittable to humans and other animals, including fleas or ticks or mosquitoes. And for these insects, a big part of what determines their habitat range is temperature. They can't live in places that are too cold. But as global temperatures change, more geographic areas become hospitable to these disease-carrying insects. So this graph here is a projection showing how the habitat range of the Aedes aegypti mosquito is expected to change under medium case climate change conditions. So not the worst case scenario, but not the best case scenario either. And the Aedes aegypti mosquito is the type that carries the diseases dengue fever, chikungunya, Zika virus, and yellow fever. And on the map, the darker red color indicates a higher concentration of mosquitoes. So as you can see, these mosquitoes are expected to gain a lot more available habitat as the climate warms. And this is just one example of how a disease-carrying bug can introduce new threats to new populations. So climate change has implications for the spread of diseases that can threaten biodiversity as well. So that's the why of why biodiversity loss is happening. And before we get into the reasons why you should care, let's pause for another checkpoint. The Alagoas curassow is a large pheasant-like bird that was once native to Brazil. Now there are only about 130 individuals that are cared for in 2 private aviaries. Out of the 8 categories established by the IUCN, how would this guy be classified? This brings us to our very last topic of discussion in these chapters, which is why should we care? Why does it matter that biodiversity loss is happening? In what ways do humans benefit from having a biodiverse world, and what do we stand to lose? One benefit we get from biodiversity is health, specifically medicine. Many medicines are based on chemicals derived from living organisms. Some examples include aspirin, morphine, artemisinin, which is a drug that's used to treat malaria, and many chemotherapeutic drugs that are used to treat cancer. So the top photo here is of Madagascar periwinkle, which is a source of cancer treatment drugs. The right photo is sweet wormwood, which is the source of artemisinin. Also, almost every antibiotic and every antiviral medication that we have available to us has been derived from natural sources as well. So what you see on the bottom is a photo of penicillium mold growing on a lemon. And this is the type of mold that is the source of the antibiotic penicillin and all of the related drugs that are in the penicillin family, like amoxicillin. What this means is that these chemicals, these medicines, they were not really invented. They were discovered. We did not make them. Nature made them. We just found them and then purified them and maybe modified them to make them a little stronger. Without this diverse range of organisms, the sophistication of our medical system would really be a shell of what it is now. And without a doubt, there are more chemicals out there that haven't been discovered yet that could serve as excellent treatments for many different diseases. But as biodiversity loss eats away at the range of living things on the planet, it's also getting rid of opportunities that we have to discover those chemicals before those organisms that make them go extinct. Another benefit we derive from biodiversity is agriculture. Although our agriculture might be a man-made artificial endeavor, it's facilitated and supported by wild ecosystems that supply pollinators like bees and wasps, and also provide nutrients in the soil and provide natural sources of pest control. Without these elements of the broader ecosystem, agriculture simply wouldn't be possible. Also, as the climate changes and farmers are facing new challenges in raising crops under different conditions, and as new plant diseases come about, it's important to maintain crop diversity so that there are available opportunities to develop new crop varieties or to improve ones through genetic modification. So think of the Gros Michel banana that we talked about. Panama disease was so devastating that that entire banana had to be replaced on a commercial level with an entirely different banana, the Cavendish banana, which was resistant to Panama disease. But what if the Cavendish banana didn't exist? What if it had already gone extinct? We might be without commercial banana production today. So biodiversity is important to maintain a robust food system. The third major benefit of biodiversity is the provision of wild food sources. We may think of our food as coming from farms or ranches that raise domesticated animals, but wild populations of fish serve as a major source for major source of nutrition for a large portion of the human population around the world. Fish farms also serve as a source of fish, but about half of our fish are still wild caught, especially from ocean fisheries, which, as you now know, are under the threat of collapse. So maintaining robust aquatic ecosystems supports the sustainability of fisheries and their role as food sources for humans. And then lastly, we have to mention another value of biodiversity, which is its intrinsic value. The previous three benefits of biodiversity were all about its instrumental value, which is the value that biodiversity has for its usefulness. How is biodiversity useful for humans? But there's also an argument that biodiversity has intrinsic value, which is the value that it has within itself, independent of its usefulness. So many people argue that living things have a right to exist, that ecosystems have value within themselves, regardless of how they can serve human purposes, and that biodiversity should be preserved for the sake of it. Some people have the stance that biodiversity is complex, it's wondrous, it's even sacred, and for these reasons we have to conserve it, irrespective of the human benefit. So in our 10th and final checkpoint, I want you to reflect on this idea. What are your thoughts? In your mind, does biodiversity have intrinsic value? And you don't need to write an essay here, but just think about it for a couple minutes and put together a couple sentences of reflection to close out this lecture.